Wizards of the Coast has demonstrated they're no longer worthy of trust with how they've been behaving poorly after their threat of the new OGL was leaked. One that throws away the intent of the original and mocks the ideas behind it. This might be one of the best things to happen to the hobby, as long as people don't want to go back to playing one game specifically. I am old enough to remember the time when speaking of things like Dungeons and Dragons in school would get you beaten up, shunned, and called many epithets daily. I have been playing Dungeons and Dragons and associated products since the late 90s at least. After being introduced to Dungeons and Dragons in middle school, I played the Gold Box games, Baldur's Gate, and Planescape Torment, only joining in the tabletop space in earnest with the release of 3rd edition. Even if we only count my tabletop experience, that's 23 years. At this point, I have at least 7 of the 5 editions of Dungeons & Dragons on my bookshelf, with 1st edition being my favorite to lean towards and crack open for inspiration. I understand that you want to make Dungeons & Dragons a lifestyle brand, but I'm unfortunately not someone that feels about any one thing specifically that I would ever buy into a brand so hard as to associate my identity with it. I hope no one else does. Products like the Dungeons & Dragons cartoon were rare and thus cherished. Dungeons & Dragons is not the whole of the role-playing or adventure gaming hobby. It's by far the largest, sure, but that does not make it the most important. I would argue that Dave Arneson's back-and-forth compromise of a 6-sided die roll to determine a scene's resolution is, as it is the basis for the entire arbitrated fantasy game. But even that is derivative of even older wargames. Dungeons & Dragons as a brand is not important. I have heard many times about people playing Dungeons & Dragons, and when I ask which edition, I get answers of Pathfinder, or Fate, or once a game of Rifts. It wasn't even Palladium Fantasy. Your drastically important brand, to many new in the hobby, or those trying to talk others into playing a game, use D&D as the general name for role-playing or adventure gaming. To me, your trademark is one step away from being genericided. Your prolificness makes you the amorphous default. If you think Dungeons & Dragons is under-monetized, then put out good content. The new setting and adventure books have been disappointing, to say the least. I have been unfortunate enough to wax on about the whimsy and fun of some of the weirdo settings like Planescape or Spelljammer for years at this point, getting new players to listen about the old adventures. Some have even picked up the vintage books, only for them to be completely disenchanted by the new books. You've dropped chunks of lore from the game and replaced it with very little. Even mechanically, things are simplified, but not well explained. I did hear a funny throwaway line the other day, that the reason the procedure guidelines weren't expanded upon is that you guys were hoping people wouldn't be able to make their own homebrew adventures as good as the published ones. But that, while funny, would be insane. I've got books from 40 years ago that break down wilderness survival and dungeon crawling into really interesting detail. That info's already out there. Why not just put it in the books again? If the problem is roughly 1 in 6 players buy things, assuming dungeon masters make up the majority of purchases, then why not put out smaller, less expensive books of thought-out content that's player-facing? 2nd edition had the complete line of books, and 3rd edition had the X and Y books that talked about 2 thematically similar classes. If the problem is that video games get more money, then put out a freemium game that people want to play. If you think Wizards of the Coast is under-monetized, why not focus on improving the rest of your brands first? You've been killing your golden goose for years. It's unsustainable. I'm well aware that you've been the owner of Wizards of the Coast for as long as I've been seriously playing their games, but it's disappointing that you don't understand what it is you had. A legitimately large company in an extremely niche set of hobbies that you are just wringing dry. It's not worth it to the hobby as a whole to fund Dungeons & Dragons. Play whatever you'd like, but don't buy the new books. Don't go see the movie. Don't watch the live-action show. The hobby will continue. The core of this hobby was always a low buy-in for many hours of making your own fun, not a monthly sub. If you, my viewer, are still here, thank you for listening. I probably reiterated things you've heard plethora of times before this last month. I'm unfortunately quite slow at this and went through several iterations in different tones and energy levels. It's been an interesting time seeing many more in the hobby thinking similarly to me. It's been novel. If you are one of the gamers that's taken this to heart, I understand your feelings, but that's just the natural conclusion of what the lifestyle brands are. You know, they'll be awesome and everywhere, and then you're personally betrayed, but it's just the natural course of business. The only way we can change that is to refuse to do business if that's how they want to operate. Even if Wizards backs down, reverts changes, and allows the old OGL to stand, we need to be vigilant. They've shown that they are willing to be underhanded and coercive and use bad faith arguments, but that won't take away the fun at my table. Until we catch up again, stay warm.